Hello and good evening. I'm calling to order this resumption of the May 1st council meeting. Madam Clerk, do we have any regrets?
Yes, Mayor Burton. Councillor O'Meara is regrets tonight, and Councillor Chisholm will be joining us shortly.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll ask if anybody has a declaration of pecuniary interest. Madam Clerk, I see none. Council, when last we were together on this council meeting, we had received the report and we had a motion on the floor that had been moved by Councillor Knoll and seconded by Councillor Lischina. And you will have received a substitute that Councillor Knoll and Councillor Lischina, in consultation with the legal department, have now circulated to you. And we have I think in fairness to our delegations who are returning to us tonight, I think we owe them a reading of your new intentions. And so Councillor Knoll and Councillor Lischina, would you like to share that with the public who are watching?
I'm happy to do that, Your Worship. What we've done is we've amended the motion slightly. The most important piece is that this motion will actually pass the bylaw tonight, as opposed to it coming back at a future time based on the wording in the amendment, juxtaposed against the original bylaw that was prepared for our previous meeting. And the legal staff have prepared the appropriate bylaw to reflect this motion should it pass tonight. So I'll read that for you at this time. So moved by Councillor Knoll, seconded by Councillor Lischina, that the revised draft bylaw 2025-088 be passed, which includes the following amendments. 1, that the bylaw shall only apply to places of worship as well as premises used on a temporary basis to host religious ceremonies or services. 2, that the bylaw shall only apply during the times that such ceremonies or services are actively taking place, including a reasonable period immediately before and after. And 3, that the bylaw shall apply to all municipal properties or parts thereof within 50 meters from the boundaries of the properties in paragraph A. 2, that the revised draft bylaw 2025-089 bylaw to amend administrative penalties for non-parking violations and orders bylaw 2021-038 be passed. 3, that consideration of the bylaw's application to any other forms of vulnerable social infrastructure, such as healthcare, social services, or educational institutions, shall be deferred for a period of 1 year to allow time for the federal government to act on its commitment made during the 2025 federal election, as announced by Prime Minister Mark Carney, to introduce protective legislation. 4, that staff be directed to monitor federal developments and return to council with a report and recommendations no later than June 1st, 2026, regarding the potential future expansion of the bylaw's application to other vulnerable social infrastructure. 5, that council requests that the Attorney Generals of Ontario and Canada introduce legislation to make an offence to intentionally and willfully obstruct access to any place of worship, school, or other vulnerable social infrastructure, and an offence to willfully intimidate or threaten those making services at these locations while allowing peaceful protests or demonstrations. 6, a copy of this resolution shall be forwarded to the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, the Minister of Attorney General for Ontario, the Members of Parliament and Provincial Parliament for Oakville, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, to express the town of Oakville's support for federal action to protect places of worship and other community spaces from targeted protests and hate-motivated disruption. So with that, Your Worship, we table that motion in replacement of our previous motion. And if I could just have a couple moments to speak to it, I appreciate it.
I wish you would. I think it's important for the public to understand that, as I understand it, and I'd like you to clarify this, it sounds like the question here is, shall places of worship be protected from protest disruptions? Is that, in fact, what this now becomes?
Effectively, that's exactly it. And I want to drill down into a little bit more. The bylaw itself talks about, goes in great detail about what is a specified protest. And this is a really very important part to emphasize to the public. So to first of all start with what it's not a ban on protests. It's no way an impingement on people's constitutional rights to protest. What it is it is a restriction on the type of protest that can occur within 50 meters of a place of worship, or, as I said earlier, another facility that's being used for place of worship, like a community center or such, only during the time upon which it's being used for that purpose. And the specified protest is very, very scoped. It says, a specified protest means to advise or persuade or attempt to advise or persuade a person to refrain from accessing vulnerable social infrastructure. B, persistently request that a person refrain from accessing vulnerable social infrastructure. C, physically interfere with or attempt to physically interfere with a person accessing vulnerable social infrastructure. D, repeatedly approach, accompany, or follow a person accessing vulnerable social infrastructure. Or E, intimidate or attempt to intimidate a person or otherwise to do so or say anything that could reasonably be expected to cause concern for a person's physical or mental safety. Now, these are relatively high bars to meet in terms of what would be applicable under this act. We are not attempting in any way to compromise people's ability to peacefully protest and conduct themselves in accordance with decency and the law. This is simply trying to identify certain behaviors that are inappropriate when applied in a place where people have another constitutional right, and this place to work, the right to worship. And so this scoped down bylaw should certainly answer the concerns of a number of members of the community who have expressed their trepidation about our desire to try to somehow impugn their rights to freedom of protest. This does not do that. It basically, again, it's establishing certain behaviors that are unacceptable that have a huge impact on the ability of people to exercise their right to the freedom of worship and to be able to worship in their God in their place of worship. So with that, Your Worship, we look forward to the delegations, and I look for my council colleagues' comments, questions, and support when the question gets called.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lischina, as a seconder, do you have any comments?
Thank you, Your Worship. I will wait for the delegations first.
Thank you. All right. I hope that the delegations have been able to hear the explanation that the councillor has just given about the nature of this matter. And I will preface, as we go to the delegations, I want to make clear that under our procedure here, in order to have an orderly meeting and to address the business that is before us, comments are limited to the business before us, and that is, as outlined by Councillor Knoll, or perhaps as summarized by my statement, shall places of worship, whether they're designated places of worship or temporary ones, be protected from disruption by protests. And with that, Madam Clerk, would you please call the first delegation?
Thank you, Mayor Burton. We did send invites out to those who were unable to delegate, and currently we have 14 people who've come back into the meeting to finish. So first is Mark Sandler.
Welcome, sir. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, councillors. Just by way of introduction, I'm the chair of the Alliance of Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism, a coalition of just under 60 community organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish. I've fought anti-Semitism for 40 years. I've trained police and prosecutors across the country on legal measures, criminal and municipal, to combat hate of all forms. And I've appeared before the House of Commons and Senate Justice Committees on proposed legislation to address hate, and before the Supreme Court of Canada on the interplay between combating hate and freedom of expression. You've received a series of submissions, probably too many submissions, but at the various stages of your process, you've received 3 groups of submissions from me. The most recent answering objections made by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association to the bubble legislation. So in my brief deputation, time only permits me to address 2 points. The first is the motion that has been amended, that has been presented to Council for your consideration. I respectfully, notwithstanding the good intentions of the motion, and notwithstanding the fact that the motion is much improved from that which was presented at the last council meeting, I say respectfully, the deferral is problematic for several reasons, and let me explain why. The Prime Minister, while campaigning, indicated as one of his campaign promises that the government would introduce federal legislation described as bubble legislation. Well, he has a minority government, which limits his legislative options. The government's priority may very well be economic issues, including tariffs and the relationship, as you know, between the United States and Canada. New legislation has not been drafted. It hasn't been considered by the House of Commons and Senate Justice Committees at any point to this point. It hasn't been placed, of course, before the House of Commons. There's no guarantee that it would be given any priority. And more importantly, and what is lost sight of here, is that the legislation would be criminal legislation, which would require proof of conduct that is appropriately characterized as criminal. And part of what's lost here, with great respect, is that bubble legislation is not intended to only address conduct that rises to the level of criminality. It's intended to address in a preventative way conduct that has the potential of undermining the reasonable safety and security concerns of those who attend either places of worship or other vulnerable infrastructure. And you don't simply have to take it on my authority or based upon my submission, because there's a basic misunderstanding that's held in some circles about bubble legislation. And if I can commend one thing for you for your consideration in evaluating both whether there should be a deferral and the precise language of the legislation, let me say this, that much has been said about whether or not bubble legislation interferes with freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But this isn't just an idle debate for those of us who are interested in the issue. The issue was fully addressed by the British Columbia Court of Appeal in the case of Spratt. The legislation in British Columbia addressed bubble legislation relating to access to abortion center services. And the legislation in British Columbia made it clear that it is designed not merely to be activated in circumstances where someone has already harassed, intimidated, impeded physically access. It's intended to be designed in a way that people feel safe in coming to an abortion clinic without having to run through a gauntlet of people or otherwise who are in close proximity to their points of access and to the vulnerable institutions themselves. So the BC Court of Appeal unanimously in Spratt held that that legislation survived constitutional scrutiny, even though it created a limitation on protest activity, not merely intimidation, not merely harassment, not merely obstruction, but protest activity, because protest activity against the institution and its occupants was regarded to be such as to undermine their feelings of safety and security. And the point of the British Columbia Court of Appeal's decision was, this has nothing to do with prohibiting freedom of speech. This has nothing to do with prohibiting the content of speech, but nonetheless, one could prohibit even speech that does not otherwise violate the law because its close proximity to vulnerable institutions leaves people reasonably feeling unsafe. And that's the point. And I say with great respect that I understand why, and I applaud the council for crafting something that is intended to withstand constitutional scrutiny. But in doing so, you've run up against the difficulty of you've crafted the legislation in such a way that it basically forces proof of prior intimidation or harassment or obstruction or interference before it can be triggered. And that's not what the British Columbia Court of Appeal said was necessary in order to survive constitutional scrutiny. And I'm also going to point out to you that the legislation was upheld and an application was brought to the Supreme Court of Canada to challenge the constitutionality of the British Columbia legislation. And the Supreme Court of Canada declined to even hear the application to challenge the legislation. So my point is twofold. The first is that I say with great respect, I welcome and applaud this council's effort to introduce bubble legislation. It's important, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise that I won't be pleased at the adoption of the bubble legislation. But I say with great respect, it's too narrow in focus in addressing the harm and the preventative measures that bubble legislation is intended to address. Second of all, I say that the closer your language adheres to what has been constitutionally upheld by the British Columbia Court of Appeal and were leaves denied to the Supreme Court of Canada, the higher likelihood, if not the certainty, that the legislation cannot be challenged constitutionally. The last point I wish to make is let's not conflate criminal law and municipal law. First of all, the motion suggests that the federal government should be passing legislation that deals with several topics. I have to say with great respect, that legislation already exists. There is legislation that addresses intimidation that would uncover intimidation of the kind that you described. There's an intimidation section of the criminal code. There's also legislation that involves the interference with religious institutions and social gatherings and services that are conducted within. And in my respectful view, what is not needed is additional criminal legislation, though I'll look with interest at what the federal government, if it chooses to do so, ultimately introduces. But what is really needed is preventative legislation that can be done at the municipal level that is not intended to address only criminal conduct, but to address the well-being and safety of those who are attending. Last point, and then my time will be up. And the last point is this, that I suggest that as an appropriate alternative to deferring other vulnerable infrastructure to await a government bill that really isn't applicable because it's criminal legislation and in any event may or may not ever come, that it would be better to pass the legislation with a broader scope of vulnerable infrastructure, such as has been contemplated in other municipal legislation and even in your earlier drafts. And then you can always revisit the need for that additional infrastructure being introduced if the provincial government or the federal government were ever to do anything that would make the legislation superfluous. That would better show your commitment to those communities who are vulnerable. I understand, as I said, the well-meaning intention of the motion. I applaud the intention of council in addressing this matter, but I have those respectful suggestions to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your detailed information. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Alaya Khan.
Welcome, Ms. Khan. Council
Yes.
looks forward to your information.
Thank you so much, Mayor Burton and town councilors. My name is Dr. Alia Khan, and I live and practice in Oakville. And I am concerned about the efforts to restrict the right to protest, peaceful protest through bubble bylaws. We have recently heard from Mark Sandler regarding his comments, and I feel that criminal conduct can be addressed through criminal legislation, but we should not criminalize peaceful dissent, as this violates our charter-protected freedoms and sets a dangerous precedent for civic engagement. In fact, the BC Civil Liberties Association called this a watershed moment of peril for civil liberties in Canada. In Vaughan, I'd like to remind everyone that authorities responded to protests exposing the sales of properties in illegal Israeli settlements by silencing those demanding accountability rather than addressing the violations themselves. And similar bans are being considered now in other cities and towns in Canada. These bans will shrink public space for peaceful protest and silence dissent. These bubble bylaws will criminalize peaceful protest, and these bans will silence Palestinian voices and anti-Zionist Jewish voices and all those who denounce the massacres of killing of children and forced starvation of an entire nation of 2 million people. We do not want to see more killing, and we are asking for these public protests to not be banned. We must not allow protests to be banned. The right to protest is fundamental to our democracy.
Dr. Khan, thank you very much for your information and your salient points. Council, someone has a microphone open, and the noise was, I think, distracting from Dr. Khan's message. So I would ask wherever that's from, that noise is from, that we try to silence that. Dr. Khan, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you so much, Mayor Burton, and thank you.
Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
Josh Lando.
Good evening, councilors. And sorry, just turning on my camera now.
Welcome, sir.
Good evening.
We look forward to your information.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good evening to yourself and members of council. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. I'm appearing on behalf of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, where I serve as Director of Government Relations, Ontario. CJA is a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization representing Jewish Canadians affiliated through their local Jewish federations across Canada. We were pleased that at the December 14th meeting, Council unanimously directed staff to engage in a consultation, investigate a draft bylaw to address certain forms of protests. We certainly commend you and thank you for doing so. Unfortunately, the draft bylaw that has come forward falls short in several elements, and it's CJA's position that amendments are needed to ensure that the bylaw is effective. In March, we provided a submission outlining our position that it should be similar to the City of Vaughan's bylaw 143/2024, which would prohibit nuisance demonstrations, protests within 100 meters of houses of worship, schools, childcare centers, hospitals, or congregate care facilities. And we argued that the bylaw should be strong by including consequences for noncompliance, specific enforcement powers, and be actively enforced, prevent any potential irregularities or issues arising from overt or subjective bias by including a clear definition of a nuisance demonstration, and provide clear direction and establish an objective test to determine when that threshold of a nuisance demonstration has been reached, as well as include a clause that allows enforcement flexibility to increase the protest perimeter as needed based on the size and scale of the demonstration. As I stated earlier, unfortunately, the draft bylaw that has come forward tonight has some gaps, and while it's a good start, it is our position that amendments are needed. Like the City of Vaughan's, the Oakville bylaw should capture houses of worship, schools, childcare centers, and community institutions and places to be protected. And one of the amendments before council tonight is that consideration of the application to other forms of vulnerable social infrastructure be deferred for a period of 1 year to allow time for the federal government to act on their commitment made during the 2025 federal election. It's important to note that while the Prime Minister made that commitment during the campaign, there's no guarantee that such action will in fact be taken within the timeline of 1 year. And effectively, for that time period, these institutions would remain under threat of intimidating protests. So we strongly urge council to include those other forms of vulnerable social infrastructure within the bylaw now in order to protect those institutions and those who use them. Two other items within the motion amendment was that the bylaw shall apply only to places of worship as well as premises used on the temporary basis to host religious ceremonies or services, and the bylaw shall apply only during times that such ceremonies or services are actively taking place. It is important to note that houses of worship operate and provide a variety of services to community members, not just prayers. Synagogues have events at various times of day, during any given day or week, not just the daily 3 prayers that Jews customarily say. For instance, I attended a community event for Yom HaShoah in late April at a synagogue, and before the service, I went to a room where a young boy was learning his bar mitzvah portion with his tutor. Shortly before, there were the daily afternoon and evening prayers. And after that, the community event took place, which is why I'm saying this, because the synagogue and what it provides is a community space and a sacred one to be protected at all hours, not during religious ceremonies or services. Another item to discuss is the proposed perimeter, 20 meters, and then the 50 meters as proposed in the amendment motion are insufficient. Other municipalities have implemented safe access legislation or bylaws that have set 100 meters as the perimeter to ensure community institutions remain safe and those that use them are not intimidated by protests. Within the staff reports noted that 100 meters would extend into residential areas and other property. And while that's accurate, it's also true of other jurisdictions where these safe access zone bylaws have been established. So to ensure consistency, better protect individuals and institutions, I implore council to look at ensuring that the bylaws establish a uniform 100-meter safe access zone for protests. And another item to note is that we believe the bylaw omits the city manager's ability to close streets and other town property. The City of Vaughan's municipal bylaw grants that to the deputy city manager, community services, or designate in order to order the closure of the highway, including roadways, boulevards, sidewalks, trails, or pathways, or any public space. The bylaw also permits the redirection of vehicular or pedestrian traffic, including the placement of barricades when deemed necessary. The absence of this provision in Oakville's draft bylaw is a significant one. And while the report notes that the town's temporary road closure bylaw 2007-135 already delegates authority to staff to temporarily close a highway, C2 maintains that this power should be explicitly included in the new bylaw to support its enforcement. Understand that some argue against the bylaw, claiming that implementing one is unconstitutional. Our argument is that this is false. While the rights to freedoms of expression and assembly are fundamental to Canadian societies, these rights are not absolute and are subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law. Section 1 of the Charter allows for the balancing of benefits versus negative impact of reasonable limitations of these rights. And there must be a reasonable balance between the protesters' right to civil disruption and the well-being of those in society looking to use those vulnerable institutions. To conclude, the draft bylaw should be strengthened by addressing the items discussed earlier. Thank you for the time to present to you this evening, and thank you to council as well for your work on this.
Thank you for your information, sir. Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
Anna Starkova.
Welcome, Ms. We look forward to your information.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I very firmly stand against this law, as I believe it is a thinly veiled attack on our charter rights. I would like to argue that places of worship are not vulnerable infrastructures. Religious institutions are closely protected places of power, and when that power is abused, the abuse victims do not have a lot of recourse. While this law seems to be for the protection of individuals attending the institution, in writing, it is protecting the institution from the criticism of dissent. I'm afraid that this law will disproportionately affect the people of the in-group, people already using the church, the synagogue, and will make them unable to voice their grievances. In 2020, the Canadian Supreme Court ruled in favor of abuse victims of Father Marshall, who abused children for 54 years, with the Catholic Basilian Church covering him and moving him from parish to parish in Toronto and Etobicoke. While the trial was going on, one of the abuse victims very bravely stood in front of the church with a sign that read, "Child victims of sexual assault by priests become adults waiting for church leaders to make changes." This victim has stopped waiting. You, the people, are the church. Demand change, demand accountability. If this bylaw was in place 50 meters from the property line, that often includes the parking lot, which is quite a big distance. I'm not sure if this man would have been brave enough to hold his sign in a place where the parishers would see it, where his sign would make an impact. People have a really hard time suing the sovereign nation of Vatican, a system set up to make the church be a state on par with Canada. While it is very generous of the city of Oakville with the operating budget of about $300,000 to protect the vulnerable infrastructure that is backed up by the Vatican with an operating budget of about 120 million, I don't think this law is needed. The phrasing of this bylaw is too general, in my opinion. It specifies that protests can't intimidate or attempt to intimidate a person or otherwise do or say anything that could reasonably be expected to cause concern for a person's physical or mental safety when accessing vulnerable infrastructure. What if the vulnerable infrastructure is the thing that caused concern for the person's mental or physical safety? This law is firmly placing its power on the scale of in favor of the institution and disregards the victims of those institutions from the survivors of residential schools to the abuse victims of parishes. It takes a long time for this kind of abuse to come out, and I think it is important for Oakville to have a legal way to protest it. As vulnerable as a church may be, the people attending it are more vulnerable still, and I don't think this law is really focusing on them. I believe it's focusing more on the institution itself. I would also like to mention the synagogue that everybody's talking about, the Beth Abraham Yosef in Thornhill. That is the reason that this bylaw is being proposed. As you heard in the previous delegation period, the reason for the protest was the sale of Palestinian sale of land in occupied West Bank. The rabbi of the church, Rabbi Daniel, said, while the majority of land for sale is in Israel proper, there was a chance that the land outside of that, meaning occupied territories in both UN and Canada, declares it to be in violation of international law, will be shown to participants as well. A member of the Jews Say No to Genocide said it is an illegitimate use of a synagogue, and we're here to protest it because it is not the Judaism that represents us. Many synagogues as institutions are very closely affiliated with the Jewish state of Israel, which is why we have been hearing a lot of the support for this bylaw disproportionately from synagogues. I would like to bring to the attention of council that while the places of worship may seem like individual parishes, they're places of communal power and with huge, sometimes international interests behind them, be it the state of Vatican or the state of Israel. They do not need additional protections from our secular government. That is my presentation. I have a bit that is more of an international law, but I don't think it's quite fitting for the presentation. I had it last time. Thank you, Council.
Thank you very much for your information. Madam Clerk, would you call the next delegation?
Atif Malik.
Welcome, sir. Council looks forward to your information.
Good evening, Mayor Burton and councilors. I'm speaking here today expressing my opposition to the proposed bylaw. I do have a short presentation to your left, which I'll be speaking to as I go through the issues that I'm bringing up in my delegation. Just by introduction, by education, I have attained an undergraduate degree in public policy and attained a law degree and later articled in criminal law, where I participated in the application of the criminal code and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it is from this educational and professional background, I will be making my contentions. In the Charter, the first line, opening line of the Charter is Section 1 of the Charter, which is known as a limiting clause, a reasonably limiting clause. And what we see in the attempt being made in the draft legislation, or the draft bylaw that is being proposed, is a reasonable limitation upon Section 2 and B and C of our charter rights, which are freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. And I understand that the town, in their language, is attempting to do so out of the concerns which I'll be pointing out. And the attempt here is to use Section 1 to allow for the restriction of Section 2B and C. So on the screen, you can see Oakes test. Just quickly, where did the Oakes test arise from? Soon after passing of the charter, the Supreme Court of Canada heard a series of cases from which the Oak test was developed and created this test to ensure that Section 1, the limiting clause, is not used to restrict fundamental freedoms. If this bylaw was challenged in court, and I'll be giving examples of case law that has where a bylaw has been tested through the use of the Oakes test. If this bylaw was challenged in court, there is the possibility that this very test could be applied to assess if the limitation of rights were justified. Applying the Oakes test one can then justify the use of limiting one's rights. And as Councillor Knoll stated, there is a high bar. This legal test is stringent in that it must pass all 4 tests, where if one fails, the bylaw or law is considered unreasonably limiting. So just to go through the test, and then the contentions that I'll be making against each point. Step 1, the government that infringes the charter right must explain the objective of its impugned law or conduct. The objective must be pressing and substantial. So the objective of the bylaw is a pressing and substantial. Based upon the December 16th presentation by HRPS and the town of Oakville's report after surveys were conducted, protests have not resulted in arrests or charges between 2021 and 2024. The ability to access places of worship, schools, daycares, hospitals were not restricted. And I understand the amendment has been passed, but I've included the previous vulnerable institutions as well. This is also confirmed from the responses of the survey. The contention here would be that the bylaw would fail on this point. It is attempting to regulate speech, and historically, nuisance has not generally been used to restrict speech, creating a category for specified protests under the bylaw. And there are tools. There is a vehicle to regulate nuisance, and that would be the courts, to use the courts as a means to address a particular nuisance and seek an order against it. Specified speech is expressly regulated in the criminal code. We know that there, and I'll be mentioning those as well in a later slide, many laws that exist specifically around hate to prevent hateful speech or actions for that matter. Nuisance is being used to regulate how speech is made, which is a form of overreach, where the conduct may be offensive to an individual. The contention here is that the bylaw would not muster the necessary legal arguments to succeed. Step 2, the government must demonstrate, or in this case, the municipal body must demonstrate that the law or policy is rationally connected to the pressing and substantial objective. If the law or policy is arbitrary or serves no legal purpose, then it does not meet this standard. When considering the rationality of the bylaw as pressing and substantial, here, it may be argued that the bylaw is limiting a fundamental right. Here is Section 2B and C. Here, the wording of the bylaw is unclear. Even if demonstration is not intending to focus on the listed vulnerable places, would it default prevent the demonstration from occurring there, such as if it's just passing through it or if it's in the vicinity? Again, the contention would be that the bylaw would fail on this point. Step 3. The government must demonstrate that the law or policy is minimally impairing of the charter right. This means that the law must not impair, or the law must impair the charter as little as possible, or is within a range of reasonable supportive alternatives. Is the bylaw minimally impairing the charter right? Reasonable alternatives that have been suggested in the town's report are distances from 20 to 100 meters. That's specifically what I read from the report. In the motion that was brought forward today, it's been proposed as 50 meters from the property line. As the town's report suggests, this would place many protests deep inside neighborhoods, not the usual intended focus of demonstrations, creating potential backlog and unintended disturbances, which really would be a nuisance by having a protest somewhere where it's not intended to be, in Oakville suburban neighborhoods. And step 4, which is probably the most important part of this test. The government must demonstrate that the beneficial effects of the law or policy are not outweighed by its negative effects on the charter in question. This is generally known as the proportionality requirement. On the question of proportionality, the demand to place a bubble zone is excessive, where the HRPS has stated that police demonstrations protest, or rather, I should say, act as liaison between demonstrators and the public. And there has not been any charges, as HRPS has reported back in December 16th, nor has there been evidence of direct harm to vulnerable communities or infrastructure, where reports of accessibilities have been prevented. The infringement of the charter right may be justified if, in fact, there has been consistent prevention of accessibility of such infrastructure based upon HRPS's report. And as such, there has been none. Again, the contention would be that the bylaw would fail on point 4. I'm just quickly going to give examples of where the Oakes test has been used to strike down bylaws which were found to be charter infringing. So in the 2017 case of Bracken and Fort Erie, the protest ban on protester from municipal properties after disruptive but peaceful protest. The key findings were that the subjective feelings of discomfort or fear were not sufficient to limit charter right expressions. As such, the action failed on the minimal impairment of proportionality. And to take a quote out of the case, the judgment, where the judge stated, a person's subjective feelings of disquiet, unease, and fear are not in themselves capable of ousting expression categorically from the protection of Section 2B, and the law was struck down. In the case of Montreal City, in the year of 2005, the city bylaw banning noise amplification near places of worship. The key findings being overbroad regulation that captured all amplified sound, not just harmful noises, failed minimal impairment because it was not narrowly tailored. The quote from the judgment states, legislation is not carefully tailored to minimize rights. Infringement will not pass constitutional muster. As such, the bylaw was also struck down. In the case of Kitchener and Canadian Union of Public Employees, it was the ban on picketing along sidewalks. And I understand that the town isn't, that's not something that the town is intending to do, but just bringing this forward as an example. Banning on sidewalks in the city of Kitchener were found to be overbroad restriction with no clear evidence of harm, failed the minimal impairment test, and had the rational connection to bringing such forward a ban. In the case of Guinard, 2002, a ban on residential signs, including political protest signs. And that could be flags, it could be something of support or opposing support. The key findings from that particular judgment were that it was overbroad restriction on harmless expression, and again failed minimal impairment. Public authorities must seek to impair rights as little as reasonably possible. And again, the bylaw was struck down. So these are 4 particular cases where this particular test, the Oakes test, was used against the bylaw legislation. And in all 4 of those cases, which are they're quite recent, they're not too far off where we haven't seen major protests occur on political or issues of importance to individuals, where the bylaws were struck down for varying reasons. If we can go to the second slide. Thank you. So this particular example that I'm referring to here is the city of Montreal. And I did mention a case of Montreal having one of their bylaws struck down. This is actually in reference to a different case. It did not actually use the Oakes test. And I'm bringing this forward just as an example that it may be possible that the Oakes test may not be used in a challenge against a municipality, where in this case, it was a ban on wearing masks. And it was seen as controversial. What I'm trying to point out here is that the challenge of this case resulted in a 7-year legal challenge. And that's something that the town should consider, in that if a legal challenge is brought forward, would the town benefit from challenging the particular individual or party bringing forward the challenge against the ban, cost-wise.
Mr. Malik, excuse
Yes, sir.
me. Your time has expired. Thank you very much for your information.
Thank you, Mayor.
We have your slides and we have read them. So thanks very much for your excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
Ibrahim Beg.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome. We look forward to your information. We've allotted 10 minutes under our procedure bylaw, and you're welcome to begin.
Thank you. Before you begin my time, there's a request if town clerk can show the PDF of the revised agenda on the screen, and I will make reference to the page numbers of that PDF, and they can go to those pages if that is possible.
I'm not sure that's possible. Can you just speak from, I mean, we all have the agenda in front of us. Why don't you proceed?
Yeah, I
Madam
will.
Clerk,
I will proceed. But
Madam Clerk, excuse me, I want to reset the clock for you. Would you reset the clock? Please begin, sir.
okay, I will speak and I will make reference to the page numbers, and if you can go to those pages, that would be helpful. It would have been better if the public also had the opportunity to see those page numbers, and I think it's pretty simple. But anyway, I will proceed. I would like to highlight that the survey questions were fundamentally biased from the outset. Without proper context, many respondents would naturally lean in favor of this regulation. Critically, the survey failed to ask whether such regulation would infringe upon charter rights, and this was a glaring omission. On page number 25 of the on page number 28 of the PDF, there's a question like you can see at the bottom of the PDF there is a question text, and the question was, within the past year in the town of Oakville, do you remember a protest happening during a time when you were planning to go to or access any vulnerable social infrastructure? This question assumes protests are frequent and disruptive, which may not be true. It introduces recall bias, prompting respondents to overestimate the impact of rare or isolated events. The phrase planning to go to or access implies that there was an inbuilt impediment during the protest to their ability to access the infrastructure. A more neutral way to ask this same question would have been, in the past year, have you observed or been aware of any protests occurring near public facilities or religious services in Oakville? Page number 37, there is another question. If a bylaw was to be created, which of the following vulnerable social infrastructure do you think should be included in the potential bylaw? Again, this question presumes that a bylaw is necessary at all and that certain sites are inherently vulnerable without defining what vulnerability even means. It encourages selection based on personal bias, not objective evidence, because of the use of the word vulnerable in the question. Page number 36. If a bylaw was to be created, should there be certain times of day, such as during operating hours, when protests near vulnerable social infrastructure should be regulated? This question presupposes that protests during business hours are problematic and that regulation is the only answer, ignoring the constitutional right of to protest peacefully at relevant times. Page number 39. Have you ever participated in a protest in Oakville? This may feel intrusive and could discourage honesty due to fear of surveillance or social judgment. Participation history is also irrelevant to one's stance on protest rights. Page number 35. Do you think Oakville needs a bylaw to regulate protests around certain vulnerable social infrastructure to ensure public access to these places? This question implies that protests routinely obstruct access and that regulation is required without exploring whether current legal tools are sufficient. Neutral way to ask this question could have been, what are your views on the idea of introducing a bylaw related to protests near certain public facilities? Page number 33. What concerns, if any, did you have regarding the protest at the vulnerable social infrastructure? This leads the respondent to assume there were concerns and that the protest had a substantial impact, thus in skewing responses towards negative perceptions. At this point, I would like to ask how much time I have left so I can manage my from the content.
Please feel welcome to continue for another 6 minutes.
Okay. Page number 31. Did the protest impact your ability or decision to enter the vulnerable social infrastructure? This assumes that disruption occurred, biasing the response and failing to capture any neutral or positive experiences. Neutral way to ask this question would have been, how was your overall experience with the protest in the vicinity of a public infrastructure? Now, I would like to speak to the definition of a specified protest. The way you have defined this term, and you have used terms like intimidation, persistent persuasion, repeated approach, and accompanying. All these terms are highly subjective. They risk inconsistent enforcement depending on how individual officers interpret tone, body language, or intent. The clause advise or persuade or attempt to advise or persuade a person to refrain from accessing vulnerable social infrastructure is overly broad. It also lacks clarity. There should be a specific reference to discouraging access for its intended purpose. For example, if illegal activity is occurring at a site, for example, promoting or facilitating the sale of occupied Palestinian lands or hosting events that celebrate members of the Israeli occupation forces, which are indulged in genocide and siege of Gaza, the public should retain the right to express a position. One could argue that there are other avenues within the law to complain about religious facilities hosting or holding such events. But then by the same logic, there are already provisions in the criminal code to deal with the illegal conduct during a protest as well. Now, on page number 123 of the PDF, there's a definition of places of worship. And it says, a place of worship means a premises used for the practice of religion and faith-based spiritual purposes, wherein people assemble for religious worship, faith-based teaching, fellowship, and community social outreach, as well as premises used on a temporary basis to host religious ceremonies or services. So by this definition of a place of worship, if a place of worship is hosting a real estate event selling lands stolen by the settler colonial genocidal regime of Israel, that event and place is no longer considered a place of worship, or should not be considered a place of worship then. So on page 123 of the PDF, under the definition of a specified protest activity, I would request you to add the following sentence at the end of each of the 5 points. And I read it. For one of the purposes stated in the definition of a place of worship. So this is the sentence that I'm requesting you to include. So now, for example, point A would read as advise or persuade or attempt to advise or persuade a person to refrain from accessing a place of worship for, now this sentence adds, advise or persuade or attempt to advise or persuade a person to refrain from accessing a place of worship for one of the purposes stated in the definition of a place of worship. So if there is a purpose that is occurring at a place of worship, which is not included in the purposes of place of worship, in the definition of the place of worship, then people should have a right to disrupt and protest at or outside the place of worship. I would also like to add the phrase reasonably be accepted to cause concern for a person's physical or mental safety is extremely vague. especially the term mental safety. It may be interpreted differently by different people, including vague definitions gives an opportunity to the police to use their discretion in such scenarios. And there are very serious and legitimate concerns within the community regarding the handling of protests by police when the Halton Regional Police Chief serves on the board of directors of an organization so-called as Abraham Global Peace Initiative. This organization actively lobbies for Israel and its campaign against the Palestinians. It runs a website called jforce.org, which it says motivates community social action to help defend Israel. I pointed this out before as well. This is a very serious concern within the community circle. I would also like to add, there are outstanding procedural concerns. What is the required notification timeline for the protest? Like in your document, you mentioned some procedure related to the regulation, right? So what is the required notification timeline? How many days in advance must someone be how many days in advance once anyone intending to hold a protest request for permission? Or what defines a reasonable opportunity to leave the area before enforcement action is taken? So those all points should be clarified. And then finally, the proposed 25,000 fine is excessively punitive and disproportionate, particularly given that no crime complaints or charges have been recorded in connection with these protests in the past. And I mean, I would like to say, why were these questions even necessary in your survey when the police report itself clearly stated that there were zero crimes, zero public complaints, zero charges related to any protest activity?
Mr. Begg?
And then
Mr. Begg, thank you very much for your information. Your time has expired.
Thank you.
I appreciate very much the arguments that you've brought.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
Aisha Abdel Aziz.
Sorry. Welcome.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you very clearly. Thank you.
Great.
We look forward to your information. Please begin.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and members of Council. My name is Aisha, and I'm here today as a lifelong resident of Oakville to express my deep concerns about the proposed safe access to vulnerable social infrastructure bylaw, even in its revised form as recommended by staff. I was not planning to refer to my identity, but in light of the other delegations, I will mention that I am an Ashkenazi Jew through my mother's, whose parents and grandparents all came from Eastern Europe to Canada via Central and Western Europe. At the same time, I am also a Muslim Egyptian Canadian through my father, who came to Canada when he was in grade 7. I was myself born in Toronto and moved to Oakville before I turned 1 year old. I have consulted a legal expert to inform my view of this bylaw, although my own background is as a theoretical physicist with graduate studies completed at Stanford University. With this in mind, please allow me to explain why the actions you are proposing today threaten to deprive me and others in this community of our constitutionally protected rights. This bylaw, in both its original and revised forms, exceeds municipal jurisdiction and intrudes upon federal criminal law powers under Section 91, subsection 27 of the Constitution Act 1867. Matters such as intimidation, harassment, and obstruction are already covered under the Criminal Code of Canada. The definition of specified protest as detailed in this bylaw draft would certainly fall under the scope of this criminal conduct. This is a clear case of ultra vires, a legal term that describes when a legislative body acts beyond its jurisdiction. Criminal law is a matter of federal authority, and the municipality has neither the power nor the right to regulate it under the guise of nuisance control. Municipalities simply do not have the constitutional authority to create quasi-criminal prohibitions. Furthermore, the bylaw misuses municipal powers under the Municipal Act, misusing the definition of nuisance to capture expressive activities, such as peaceful persuasion, protest, and silent demonstration. This is not nuisance regulation, it is content regulation. The pith and substance of the bylaw make it clear that its true effect is to regulate the content of expression, For those who are not familiar with the legal term pith and substance, it refers to the essential nature or core purpose of a law, which is independent of the claims made by its authors as to its alleged purpose. I reference Bracken v. Fort Erie and Montreal v. 2952-1366, Quebec Incorporated, two landmark cases where courts struck down municipal bylaws that attempted to silence dissent under the pretext of safety. In both cases, the bylaw was found unconstitutional for overreaching its jurisdiction and infringing upon charter-protected rights. The delicate balance between freedom of speech and freedom of religion is not within the jurisdiction of municipalities. It is a constitutional matter reserved for higher courts. Moreover, the penalty structure itself is riddled with legal uncertainties. The bylaw imposes administrative monetary penalties of $400 to $500, alongside offenses carrying fines of up to $25,000 for a first offense and up to $50,000 for a second offense. It is not clear if respondents have access to a meaningful due diligence defense under the doctrine established in R.V. Sault Ste. Marie. This is a critical omission that places everyday citizens at risk of harsh penalties without proper recourse. Finally, I end with this. I do not believe that those speaking in opposition to the adoption of this bylaw today are alone in understanding why it is so fundamentally flawed as to be irresponsible in its import and impact. The recommended revisions to the bylaw are instructive. They underscore and amplify the very concerns that have been expressed here about, one, the provisions of this bylaw violating the right of residents under the Charter of Rights and Freedom, and two, the lack of jurisdiction in the town of Oakville to enact a bylaw that is clearly regulating speech and criminal conduct. The outline in the agenda of staff's recommended changes suggests very strongly that a legal opinion was given, indicating that the bylaw, as framed, raises serious risks of being struck down by the courts because it is overbroad and overreaching and would not survive a charter test. If those turn out to be the facts, it would be right for the residents of the town to seek accountability for this destructive step, a step in the wrong direction for the wrong reasons at a potentially very high litigation cost. This cost would be funded by the taxes paid by the very residents whose rights are infringed by this mistaken proposed bylaw. Beyond the constitutional violations, the process itself has been marred by procedural unfairness. At the last meeting, the rules were changed with no warning, and speakers who came prepared to express concern were shut down. Palestinian solidarity voices were relegated to online-only participation, while other voices were given privileged access in person. This is not consultation, this is asymmetry. True democratic process requires that all voices be heard, not just the ones that are politically convenient or well-funded. The exclusion of dissenting voices speaks not to safety, but to suppression. At a time when our communities need unity more than ever, the only path to achieving that unity is through open dialogue and the willingness to listen deeply to one another. To silence voices, especially those that challenge or question, is to build walls where bridges are needed. True unity comes not from forced agreement, but from the courage to engage honestly with differing views, to hear fully, and to learn from those who may see the world differently. I urge this council to recognize that public safety cannot come at the cost of charter-protected rights. The bylaw, as it stands, is an overreach, one that treads on constitutional freedoms, stretches municipal powers beyond their limits, and risks chilling legitimate democratic expression in our community. I call upon you to reconsider this path, not for the sake of political expediency, but for the principles of justice, equity, and the preservation of our constitutional rights. Oakville deserves better, and I stand here today to say that we can and must do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate it. Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
Raid Kablawi.
Welcome, sir. Council looks for, hello, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you.
Good.
Welcome. We look forward to your information.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. The delegation before me spoke really well and covered a lot of points, so I'm going to keep it a little bit light here. So good evening. Thank you for having us. To start, I'm participating as someone who stands against the bylaw, just to make that clear. I stand against it because I don't want it at all. So just to avoid any ambiguity, the bylaw is not necessary in any of its form, not the current form, not the previous form, or not any modified form where it's like could be even broader. Some have said that they don't want the bylaw because it's not broad enough, and I think it's actually fundamentally flawed. I don't want to repeat many of the points made here against the bylaw, but in listening to many arguments, I don't understand what makes a building or institution that occupies a building vulnerable. So my issue is with the definition of vulnerability or perceived vulnerability. All institutions, private or public, are protected in all municipalities. First of all, by civil behavior. I think we've had a pretty good consistent run of more than several decades right now, where the people have behaved in general civic manner. So we don't need bylaws to govern ourselves. And civic behavior have so far made our communities relatively safe to begin with, and the fact that there's no precedent for such a bylaw in Oakville adds another layer of why I'm against it. Police have testified in a town council before, several months ago, that all protests that they have attended as police enforcement before have been relatively peaceful. So there's no really precedent per se from a police perspective that there is a need for any additional bylaw. They already have jurisdiction and they already have tools to keep protests peaceful. Perceived vulnerability is not a good measure for adding bylaws, as Atif said. Everyone will then feel they are vulnerable in one way or another and make the case for being included in the definition or the umbrella of vulnerability. So basically, lacking precedent and, excuse me for the term, but a lazy definition of vulnerable status of a place is enough for me to stand against this bylaw. Furthermore, however, this bylaw is going to burden the police and make it difficult to implement or enforce, causing undue stress to the public, to the police force, and I'm sure what follows is courthouses. Some have argued in the previous council and now that spatio-temporal technicalities. Some want to dial it, more. Some want to dial it less, but it's not a technical matter. It's a fundamental issue. So whether it's 20 meters, 100 meters, or 50 meters, technically those are very difficult to measure because these institutions are not necessarily a fixed structure like, for example, a fire hydrant where you can easily take 3 long steps and say, okay, I can park my here beside, a fire hydrant 3 meters in each direction and call it a day. 50 meters is quite difficult. We can then, burden police saying, oh, I'm in meter 49 or, meter 51. It's just silly, for the lack of a better term. These institutions are not a single purpose or single use buildings. Typically, a lot of institutions or buildings are multi-purpose. So the question that arises is what makes a place of worship if other events are hosted inside? What happens when you introduce a bylaw that designates a place as vulnerable, but then this place cannot hold functions which step outside the loosely defined term of vulnerability? If we want to make the bylaw about protecting access to a place, we are either being prejudiced towards other places and other institutions. And it doesn't make sense to me that you designate everything as vulnerable to make things even, and then you just have a town that is, by definition, just vulnerable in nature, which seems not a happy place to live. I remember Chick-fil-A, a restaurant, a chain, was being protested for its owner's views on certain demographic. So this question brings me, the question that comes to mind is, are restaurants going to be vulnerable as well? Someone could argue access to food is important, maybe even more important than a place of worship. In short, we don't need any of these bylaws at all. Usually, municipalities are in a place to enforce provincial or federal laws, not venture into gray areas of the law, which is going to now burden also the council and bring scrutiny over the long term. It's not quite clear that there's a precedent. There's an unnecessary burden on law enforcement and the people as well, and it's going to cause friction that is, in my opinion, unnecessary. There's restrictive length. It's also restrictive to the usage or the purpose or the function of a building, and therefore, I can think perhaps what happens during site planning approvals. Does a place of worship put a plan to the town and say this is a place of worship, or does it make a vulnerable institution restricted to one usage and one function? It's just very convoluted. It's undefined, loosely thought of, and like my colleague said, or sorry, other delegates said, it has not been thought out and gone through the stress test. And eventually, what's going to happen is that by introducing this bylaw, you're going to create a tiered town. So what a tiered town is, you're going to create a place where there's places that are considered vulnerable and places that are not. And people are going to feel some type of way being or attending a place of worship or a medical facility or a restaurant. And their perception is that they're venturing outside a vulnerable place and they may feel unsafe. So by introducing this bylaw, you're actually creating more nervousness, more vulnerability, and you're restricting intended function and usage of a building, and you're going to just create panic all around. Thank you very much. That concludes my statement. And yeah, in essence, I'm against the bylaw in all its forms. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the time and care that you prepared your remarks with. Madam Clerk, would you please call the next delegation?
Amina Khan.
Hi there. Sorry about that.
Hello. We hear you very well.
Okay, perfect.
Welcome. We look forward to your information, and we've set the clock for 10 minutes. And we have
Awesome.
your slides up as well.
Perfect. Dear esteemed council members, my name is Amina. I come before you today not only as an educator with the Public School Board, but also as a concerned community member. I speak on behalf of myself, my students, and my fellow community members who feel increasingly silenced. What's at stake is more than individual voices. It is the fundamental right of young people to express themselves as global citizens and future change makers. I'm here to respectfully oppose the original and amended form of 10.1 regarding the proposed bylaw to ban protests near so-called vulnerable social infrastructure. Such measures risk suppressing peaceful expression and civic engagement, values that are essential to both education and democracy. Under the HDSB's DEI policy, the Halton District School Board upholds the principles of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Ontario Human Rights Code, and is committed to pursuing the elimination of direct and adverse impact discrimination on code-related grounds from its schools and its education system. The Ontario Human Rights Code and protests are related through the protection of fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression and assembly, which are crucial for peaceful protests. I will now be reading a book that was shared by my school librarian during Black History Month with my school. After the story was read to the school, teachers were sent critical thinking questions based on Goldie Mohammed's HILL framework, which outlines strategies to create equity-focused learning spaces that honor the lived experiences and brilliance of all students. Next slide, please. My Mommy Marches, written by Samantha Hawkins and illustrated by Corey Reed. Next slide, please. Next slide. You should see my mommy when she marches. Next slide. She marches like the beat of a terrific giant drum. She marches ferocious and tall like lightning burning across the open sky. She is a mighty storm like a roaring clash of thunder that rolls on and on. Next slide. You should really see my mommy when she marches. She marches loud and happy like a queen in a beauty parade with her head held high and curls in her hair bouncing up and down as she goes. She is a marching machine. Next slide, please. My mommy says that some things can't be said with just words. Some problems can't be fixed by staying in one place. Sometimes you have to say it with your feet. Next slide. My mommy marches hand in hand, side by side, in crowds of people marching for the same thing, with people she knows and people she doesn't know. But sometimes she marches by herself, just mommy and the world. Next slide, please. My mommy marches through the sunshine, through the rain, through the deepest of snow. She marches through tunnels, on sidewalks, and over bridges, all around our neighborhood and beyond our neighborhood too. Next slide. My mommy marches proud and passionate with her face lit up in the biggest smile, but sometimes she marches quietly with tears in her eyes. Next slide. She tells me that once upon a time long ago, her mommy and grandma marched too. They marched with signs held high as the clouds. They walked, sat, stood, held hands, and sang songs, marching for equal rights and a better way of life. Next slide, please. I ask mommy who she marches for. She says that she marches for everyone who cannot march like she can. Next. She marches to fix the big and small problems of the world, to say the things that need to be said, to remind people how to love, and to take the pain away from the world. This is why mommy marches. I'm already learning to march. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. It's as easy as that. I'm going to march for all the people out there who feel invisible or who just want to be heard. I will march so no one has to be scared or sad ever again. Next slide. I will march until all the frowning faces are turned upside down into smiles. I will march until all the angry words fly far away and disappear forever. I will march for freedom, for kindness, and for love, just like my mommy. Next. So after the book is read to the school, me and my class utilized these inquiry questions to make connections to our personal lived experiences. Students in my class discussed their lived experiences and proudly shared going to local protests with their family members and how inspiring it was for them. The next day, students in grade 4 and 5 held their own protests during recess, on their own, by the way. Students came with signs and were chanting alongside their classmates, all on their own accord. The HDSB's multi-year strategic plan prioritizes equity, inclusion, and the well-being to ensure a safe and welcoming learning environment for all students, families, staff, and community members. Student movements throughout history have been known to be a catalyst for change, whether it's the Vietnam War in the 1960s or the student movement in the 1980s against the South African apartheid. Student protests have always been on the right side of history. Passing this bubble bylaw would not only infringe on human rights of Canadians in direct opposition to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, this discriminatory measure would silence our students from speaking up against any injustice, and that signals a deterioration of schools' commitment to protecting free speech that emerged in the late 1960s. So, as Raed had said, I just wanted to echo his statement. I'm against the bylaw altogether. And I think as a teacher, it would be extremely sad for me that one day, if this bylaw does include schools, students won't be able to speak up against anything that they're passionate about in order to be global change makers for our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your information. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Hanadil Ahmad.
Good evening. How are you? Thank you
Very
for having me
well.
today.
It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to your information and over the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm here before you today to contest the proposed bubble bylaw zone, which seeks to restrict protests around so-called vulnerable places. This bylaw represents a very dangerous overreach that undermines our fundamental democratic rights. And I would like to address this in 4 points to you today. Point number one, freedom of expression is a cornerstone of democracy. The right to protest, to speak out against injustice, to challenge authority, and to demand change is not just a privilege, it is a fundamental freedom protected under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So by creating exclusion zones where protests are banned, or we are effectively silencing dissent in the very places where sometimes it matters the most. And yes, that does include places of worship and possibly expanding it to more institutions later on. These institutions, including places of worship, are not above the law and are not above public's right and freedoms. If any of these institutions were to infringe on anyone's rights or wrong an individual or a community, how would a regular community member or group seek justice and demand change? Protests are key in protecting the common person's well-being and rights granted by our very own charter. If a protest cannot be seen and heard by those in power at these institutions in question, then what purpose does it serve? My point number two, that this is a slippery slope. Restricting protests is a slippery slope. Today, the restriction applies to certain locations, but if we allow this precedence, then it will stop future councils. What will stop future councils from expanding these zones to other areas? Or what will stop future councils to expand the meters? Today, it's 20 meters. I believe initially when this proposed bylaw came out, it started off with 20, then went up to 40, now 50, and now what stops future councils from expanding it further? 100 meters, 200 meters, and then entirely away from Oakville, the town of Oakville entirely. And I'd like to respectfully remind everyone here today that these are our streets. These are everyone's streets, and everybody has a right of access to them anywhere to protest peacefully. Once we start carving out exceptions to free expressions, we risk a slow erosion of our rights. So I am clearly saying that I oppose this bylaw, which leads me to my point number three. There are better ways to ensure safety. If the concern is about harassment or public safety or access to an institution, we already have laws to address that. Trespassing, intimidation, and violence are already illegal. And the Halton Police has done a great job enforcing these laws so far. Not only that, they have already attested to this in the recent town hall meeting that there were not any concerning incidents resulting from protests in the town of Oakville. Instead of imposing blanket bans, we should enforce existing laws and trust in the ability of police to handle disturbances without suppressing peaceful protests. Lastly, and this is a very important point, Oakville should be a leader in democratic values. We pride ourselves on being an inclusive and engaged community. By rejecting this bylaw, we send a message that Oakville does respect dissent, does value dialogue, and upholds the rights of all of its citizens. And most importantly, by rejecting this bylaw today, let it be noted in history that the Oakville mayor and the councils present today, right now in this town hall, respected the Canadian Charter of Rights and abided by the Canadian Charter of Rights. Let it go down in our records, in yours and our records, that the mayor of Oakville and the 11 councils present here today stand for democracy and not against it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your information. Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
Muskan Arif.
Welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Hello there. Good evening, Mayor Burton, members of council and staff. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. My name is Muskan, and I am completely against the proposed bylaw in its entirety. My reasoning for this is as follows. By passing this bubble bylaw, the town of Oakville is setting a precedent to criminalize protests through proximity of 50 meters of places of worship and other vulnerable social infrastructures. Simply put, places of worship and these vulnerable social infrastructures are situated everywhere. I oppose this bylaw because my late father risked his life, was criminalized for, and faced overnight imprisonment in Pakistan for standing up for justice against a military dictatorship. And after starting a family, he brought us to Canada in pursuit of the freedom to dissent, a freedom that he believed was protected here. The proposed safe access bylaw makes me question whether the belief that Canada upholds the freedom to dissent still holds in its entirety. In the last meeting, you said that the town of Oakville's bylaw does not resemble other injustices of state oppression globally, but I would like to tell you that this bylaw presents itself as an extremely slippery slope to replicate the injustices and silencing tactics employed by states around the world. In theory, this bylaw claims to balance safety with the right to protest. However, in practice, it risks silencing the very communities it claims to protect. Justice is a universal value across all major faiths, including mine, and it's also the guiding principle of protesters. For me, protest itself is an act of worship. It's one of the ways that I live out my faith. So we have to ask, is this bylaw truly protecting the safety of those practicing their faith, or is it selectively protecting those with power in our society? Who's protecting my safety when I engage in my acts of worship? Why is the town of Oakville dictating which acts of worship are to be protected and which acts of worship are to be criminalized? By criminalizing proximity, such as being within 50 meters, this bylaw creates an undue barrier to peaceful dissent. Vague terms like specified protest open the door to criminalizing legitimate political expression. Now consider the perspective of activists protesting outside religious institutions that not only serve as places of worship, but also host public events, such as real estate sales promoting settlement activity on occupied Palestinian land, which violates international law. Are we to remain silent simply because these events take place in a religious building or within another social infrastructure? Harmful, unethical, and even hateful events can and do occur in religious settings, as well as within vulnerable social infrastructure. By passing this bylaw, you are not protecting the vulnerable, you are protecting the powerful and silencing those who dare to speak out. If any bylaw should be passed, it should be a bylaw standing against unjust, illegal, harmful, and unethical events hosted within and weaponized by places of worship. As we have seen over the past year and a half, places of worship do often function beyond spiritual practice, hosting events with clear political and material consequences. Accountability must not be off limits simply because of the venue. Now, as a proud queer Muslim, I know firsthand that faith and dissent against politically funded voices can coexist. My community and I, we regularly speak out against harmful power structures within our own places of worship, because love for our faith does not mean silence in the face of injustice, especially when those in power weaponize religion and places of worship. I know that you don't want to hear about why we protest tonight, but I just want to remind everyone that Stonewall was a protest. Actually, it was a riot that was born out of necessity, not politeness. It was loud, disruptive, and unapologetic. Stonewall was a turning point. That uprising sparked the modern 2S LGBTQIA+ rights movement and led to the first Pride. The rights we have today exist because people refuse to stay silent and compliant in the face of injustice. So when you try to regulate how we resist, where we gather, or how we raise our voices, please remember that change has never come silently. Further, are you considering the perspective of abuse survivors protesting outside so-called vulnerable religious institutions that continue to shield their abusers? Places of worship, regardless of faith, must not be placed above accountability. If we outlaw peaceful dissent near so-called vulnerable religious spaces, then we are no longer protecting the vulnerable. We're actually empowering those in power and those voices with political funding and backing to control where and when harm can be named. Is this truly the direction that we want Oakville or Canada to go? I kindly implore this council to not pass this bylaw. Please do not legislate silence under the guise of safety, and please reflect on who you intend to keep safe and who you intend to silence through this bylaw. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you for your presentation. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Sarah Khan.
Welcome, Ms. Khan. Do you want to have a mic check to make sure we can hear you? I was afraid of that. We can't hear you. All right, well, while we wait for Ms. Khan to reconnect, and so that then we can hear her, would you call the next delegation?
Lama Agad.
Ah, we have Ms. Khan back already. Perhaps we can ask Ms. Agad to wait.
Sure, no problem.
Ms. Khan, how are you doing with audio?
Apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, and very clearly. Thank you for rejoining us. We will set the clock for 10 minutes and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you kindly. Again, apologize for that. So in terms of just to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Sarah Khan. I'm a tax-paying Oakville citizen and a physician who works at a university hospital and attends religious institutions here in Oakville regularly, and recognizing that we are actually attending institutions that have had the most lethal attacks against any religious community that have occurred in Canada. And I say this in light of previous delegations that have noted similar strifes that have occurred in religious institutions. I want to report some data that in the past 10 years, more Muslims were killed in targeted hate attacks due to Islamophobia than in any other G7 country. And many of these hate crimes occur in religious institutions such as the Quebec mosque attack. So while many in my community know what fear feels like when you attend a religious institution, I still oppose this bylaw. While I understand the councillors want specific feedback on technical aspects of the bylaws, I think what myself and fellow delegates are trying to convey is the problematic nature of the bylaw. And before I can sort of explain, and I think other delegates have already sort of explained some of the problems in the bylaw, the vagueness and the subjectivity in which it can be applied, I do want to provide a bit of context. So if you can allow me to explain why I believe Oakville's institutions taught me the importance of protest, explain from a healthcare worker perspective and a university professor perspective why this bylaw I believe to be more harm than good, regardless of it being 20, 50 or 100-meter distances, and explain why we must uphold fundamental principles of democracy and charter freedoms, as we have always done, regardless of the divisive issues we face here in Canada, namely because of the problems this bylaw really brings to light. So I've been a proud citizen of Oakville since I was 5. As a high school student, I first learned about the importance of social justice and human rights at the Oakville Centre for Peace, Ecology and Human Rights. These early experiences allowed me to understand social justice issues. And as a university student in London, Ontario, I regularly engaged in protest. And I use the word protest purposely. To be clear, none of us here countering this bylaw engage in what has been described as nuisance demonstration, as defined by the CCLA. None of us are inciting hate, intolerance, or discrimination of any protected groups based on race, ethnic origin, color, religion, etc. To speak more to protest, again, in Victoria Park in London, Ontario, I protest various global injustices, from the Iraq War to the hijab ban, to Israeli apartheid. And what I would like to highlight from these protests is we didn't disrupt local businesses surrounding infrastructure, and police presence was actually typically there to protect us from white supremacist counter-protesters. I also want to point out that specifically these central locations that protests occur at are close to and in proximity to churches, healthcare institutions, etc. The nature of protest is to be in the hearts of cities, to create awareness and reach broader community and decision makers. This tends to be located in central locations where critical infrastructure will inevitably be in close proximity. And that will include churches, places of worship, clinics, and hospitals. And I recognize the amendment proposes only churches, only religious institutions. I also want to point out that as a healthcare worker, I've worked at different hospitals where protesters sometimes gather outside. Myself and colleagues participated in protests related to cuts to healthcare for refugee and newcomer patients. I recall protesting in downtown Toronto, near Queen's Park, which is again in the center of where Toronto hospitals are located. As a previous delegate demonstrated, 20 to 100 meters will be in close proximity to any of these critical or vulnerable spaces. As a frontline healthcare worker during COVID, I remember our hospitals being full to capacity, dealing with the challenging and scary times that we faced. And in the middle of a pandemic, a convoy of anti-vax protesters camped outside of Parliament, blocking critical infrastructure, violating noise bylaws for weeks in Ottawa. And while an inquiry was done, no bylaws were enacted. It's curious that when people take to the streets for Palestine, exceptional, unprecedented breaches of our rights in the form of problematic, non-specific, overreaching legislation is suddenly urgently necessary. As a university professor, I stood in solidarity with students in encampments, peacefully protesting their university's complicit investment in an ongoing genocide as declared by the Doctors Without Borders, genocide scholars, including the Lemkin Institute and Amnesty International. I could walk over from the hospitals to a peaceful encampment site to join vigils, discussion on the long history of student movements, and lectures about the systematic destruction of healthcare in Gaza, the targeting of relief workers, the unlawful abduction, torture, and rape of healthcare workers, the violations of international law, and the Geneva Conventions live stream for us to all watch. My university is within 100 meters of multiple religious institutions. Where will we be allowed to gather? Where can we grieve? Where can we have vigils? Where can we voice outrage to the institutional decision makers that arm and enable injustice? I came today to delegate because for the past 18 months, I need to use any opportunity to ensure we can speak up for our colleagues in Gaza that are violently being bombed, stripped of any decency and targeting for trying to protect their patients and care for their communities. I come today to speak to why the values Oakville taught me, the importance of protest, and freedom of assembly to stand for those with no voice. But my life experiences have shown me, and it would be abundantly clear to everyone willing to genuinely reflect on this bylaw, that this law is a manifestation of the Palestine exception, that guardrails only need to be placed when a discussion of Palestinian freedom or rights are being brought to light. This bylaw is impractical, redundant, criminalizes any ability to meaningfully protest simply because vulnerable social infrastructure is part of what makes a community safe and vibrant. Protests, similarly, are a critical part of the social infrastructure of a functioning democracy. It's unrealistic to limit the physical space where protests will need to occur in relation to vulnerable social infrastructure. While I appreciate the bylaw uses the term specified protest, which tries to distill specific activities that narrow the scope to harmful activities, this definition is far too vague and subjective. Approaching a person, intimidation of a person, these words could be applied in a variety of benign circumstances. In fact, many pro-Palestine protests that have occurred have resulted in violent actions by pro-Zionist counter-protesters. Take the example of Lorna Birnbaum, who violently tore off the hair covering from a protester, and the Crown dropped the charges. The very laws meant to protect people and their right to protest are being weaponized against us to cater to a vocal minority. We live in a functioning democracy where legislation already exists, and to prevent hate speech, ensure protests are safe and no damage occurs to any surrounding infrastructure, as we heard from our Halton Regional Police Services already. This bylaw is simply a tool of racism, a huge double standard, and a slippery slope towards fascism. We see what is happening in the US with restrictions of freedom of speech and protests by students and faculty in post-secondary institutions, and even cuts to funding of healthcare research and healthcare provision. We cannot fall victim to this last attempt by settler colonial fascists to continue to keep a mask on any criticism of the state of Israel, and this bylaw is clearly another classic ploy to distract from the real issues, the issues we have been protesting and continue to until justice and peace can exist for all people. Canadians from coast to coast can see this. I hope the town of Oakville will not fall to the tyranny of organizations and individuals that use these bylaws to hide within buildings of vulnerable social infrastructure to commit crimes, selling land that has been illegally annexed, which is a violation of international law. Who is this bylaw meant to protect? And who does this bylaw criminalize? It's abundantly clear from the feedback you've already received that Oakville citizens oppose this bylaw. It's impractical, its enforcement will be costly, and there's no historical evidence per the Halton police data to suggest protests have resulted in physical harm or crimes. Meanwhile, protesting a genocide in close proximity to any institution will result in fines and potential criminal charges. Please make the sensible decision to utilize the existing laws to ensure our right to protest and our freedom of speech remain protected, and that any hate speech is not tolerated by anyone in any circumstance. And pop this bubble bylaw once and for all. This is my submission, subject to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. You packed a lot into a limited amount of time. Madam Clerk, would you please call the next delegation? Ms. Agad, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Hello, Your Worship. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mayor Burton and Council, for allowing me the opportunity to speak today on this crucial matter. My name is Lama Agad. I'm an Oakville resident, as well as I'm a journalist who advocate for freedom of expression, including the freedom and right to protest. While I'm going to address some comments about this bylaw, let's keep in mind two key things. The right to protest is protected under the Constitution, and freedom of expression is a fundamental right. Regarding the proposed bubble zone bylaw, I believe this is fundamentally a security issue rather than a protest issue. We know that the police canceled the Indian General Consul's visit to the Hindu temple located on Bronte last year due to security concerns. Peaceful protests, however, pose no threat and should be protected. Laws already exist to prevent harassment, trespassing, and safeguard places of worship, schools, and hospitals. We have enough laws for that. If there have been other incidents at places of worship in Oakville beyond what was planned at the Hindu temple that had a violent nature, I'd appreciate clarification. For example, how is this bylaw going to help the Indian consulate to come to Oakville or Halton region safely, and his event won't be canceled again by the police? How is it going to prevent a criminal, for example, from coming into a mosque and kill worshippers like what happened in the Quebec terrorist attack? As for the police report mentioned in your report, they clearly stated there are 0 crimes related to protests in 2020, 2022, 2023, and 2024. There are 0 complaints for the public regarding protest. 2 protests were monitored in 2024, 0 charges laid from protests in 2022, 2023, and 2024. So I also want to highlight a very important concern. This bylaw is being pushed by groups tied to Israel who have been advocating for it in this meeting and in the past meeting and the meeting before that. Their aim is to suppress criticism against a country engaged in genocide in Gaza. This directly impacts Palestinian residents in Oakville who must retain their right to protest governmental support for Israel and also protest events that are affiliated with Israel, such as the occupied Palestinian lands that are being hosted in religious places. Peaceful protests shouldn't be banned, especially when they address significant injustices. What we really need are laws that truly address and prevent the weaponization of anti-Semitism, for example. Some pro-Israel organizations represented here today and in the last meeting and the meeting before have a history of misusing this term in ways that have harmed Oakville residents and have increased division and fear in our communities. If this bylaw risks worsening those divides, we must focus on crafting solutions rooted in fairness and unity. What we need is to elevate the Canadian values that prioritize human rights. These rights are inherent in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, alongside various federal, provincial, and territorial laws. Lastly, I may support this bylaw temporary if it only specifies the regular weekly times of prayers. I will support this bylaw if it prevent violence or prevent protest with violent nature, but I can never support it when it includes premises used on a temporary basis to host ceremonies or services. This is extremely vague, it's extremely unclear, and should not be included in this bylaw. I would suggest that this bylaw to be deferred or adjourned until we see what the Prime Minister will be proposing in that regards. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much for your points. I appreciate them. Madam Clerk, would you call the next delegation?
Cy Brown.
Mr. Brown, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to, we've set the clock for 10 minutes, and we look forward to your information.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Burden and members of Town Council. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today and for the leadership you have continued to demonstrate in working towards an effective and enforceable bylaw to protect Oakville citizens. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Lions of Judah, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization dedicated to identifying and filling the gaps necessary to build a stronger, safer, and more resilient community. Our mission is to protect and support communities facing targeted harassment, ensuring their ability to live, worship, and function without fear. Over the past year, we have collected and cataloged extensive evidence, including videos, images, and witness statements, and victim reports that document the disturbing reality of hate-motivated nuisance protests. Our efforts are focused on advocacy, education, and policy recommendations that help strengthen public safety and community cohesion. Some of this evidence was shared with Town Council ahead of the last meeting to provide absolute clarity with regards to the dangerous and aggressive nature of the nuisance protests that's being discussed. My understanding is that it is the request of the mayor to focus delegation today on the proposed amendment brought forward last week when we witnessed aggressive disruption forcing the early adjournment of this council. While that was an unfortunate incident, it speaks very clearly to the urgency of the bylaw and amendment before you. That episode, along with the disturbing event at a local high school just last week, where during a nuisance protest at the high school, students were subjected to graphic, upsetting imagery, are clear demonstrations of the real-world harm nuisance protests can cause when left undeterred. These were not peaceful protests or polite demonstrations. These are local, deliberate, aggressive, costly, and profoundly damaging. The proposed direction in the amendment to request additional support from federal and provincial legislation is welcome. We applaud Council for taking that bold step. However, as was evidenced right here in Town Council and again in the targeting of the students at Oakville Trafalgar High School this week, we cannot wait to find out if and when higher levels of government will act, while the threats of targeted groups are real and happening now. As we have all experienced, these processes can take months, if not years, and there is argument to be made that action at the municipal level allows for the opportunity to tailor the needs of the legislation to most efficiently address the citizens of the region while simultaneously delivering a constitutionally defendable bylaw. And so the LOJ makes two recommendations for your consideration pertaining to the amendments brought forward by Councillor Knowles last week. First, in light of the May 8th high school incident where students were targeted by a nuisance protest at their place of learning, we respectfully suggest that Council consider including schools alongside places of worship to be afforded these protections. Educational institutions are social infrastructure attended by our most vulnerable, the children. There's an opportunity today to act locally for the direct benefit of our students and educators who deserve the same safeguards from targeted harassment, particularly in places of learning that should remain safe, respectful, and free of intimidation. Second, vulnerable infrastructure like houses of worship provide a sanctuary and safe space to communities in addition to the role they play in being a place for congregation, religious services, and ceremonies. The current mention of limiting the bylaw's protection to an hour before or after a service takes place exposes these locations to continued costly and dangerous targeting, and so we urge Council to envision the gap that limitation would create in the effective protection of this important piece of legislation. Council has both the power and responsibility today to act swiftly in the interest of public safety, protecting not only faith groups, but also school communities and others who increasingly find themselves targeted. To be clear, as we have all now personally experienced, there is nothing peaceful in the manner these nuisance demonstrations are conducted. From the provocative calls to action online, the loudspeakers, smoke flares, hateful signage, and vitriol, in practice, these demonstrations more closely resemble tribal conflict of one group targeting another at their known safe space. That never ends well. The amendment is not about limiting free speech, which remains a recognized important right for all Canadians, and that is still protected by the careful considerations this Council has taken in the process of drafting this bylaw. This is about drawing a firm line against targeted harassment, where under the guise of free speech, aggressive bad actors are targeting and hurling hateful rhetoric at identifiable communities, particularly in safe spaces that serve our most vulnerable, and draining community and municipal resources that are required to protect citizens in that act. For your added consideration, this activity of targeting a community at their vulnerable spaces operates under the fallacy of collective blame, painting all attendees of that location as being of unified mind on the topic of protest, which is both faulty logic and unnecessarily dangerous. On behalf of the LOJ, we commend your continued leadership in taking action in passing this bylaw with consideration to our recommended amendments. Oakville has the chance to continue setting a national example, not only as the most livable town in Canada, but as one that refuses to tolerate intimidation or hate in any form. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
Hugh Doherty.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Doherty. Welcome. Council looks
Yes.
forward to your information. Give us a
Thank you
second
for-
while we reset the clock, please.
Sure.
Please begin.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, City Council, and those gathered today, I have a preamble for my talk. Following my preamble, I will speak a little about the history of protests and then address why I believe this bylaw exceeds your authority as a municipal body. I will also outline why no government or religious institution should be granted any special status or extraordinary rights. At the last meeting, there was a statement made that delegates were only welcome to state whether they were for or against the bylaw. I would like to clarify that in this democratic process, we have different roles. I am a delegate here to allocute on behalf of my position concerning the proposed bylaw, and I am entitled to 10 minutes to do so. The council is the party ultimately responsible for voting on the measure. I ask that you don't speak for me, and I shall not vote for you. You are elected councillors considering a bylaw that I believe violates my charter protected rights. I came here previously to tell you why I believe your proposed bylaw offends my rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But before that meeting even began, you changed the wording of item 10.1 at the last minute without any notification to the delegates that I am aware of. Those of us who came to speak prepared in good faith expected a fair and equal hearing. You used the last minute changes to cut off speakers, rule people out of order, and shut down dissent. That procedural manipulation compounds the violation of our rights. This is the second time I have witnessed you weaponize a last minute change. It stripped us of fair process on the top of proposing a bylaw that already chills our right to peaceful expression. I am here to ask you to stop this process, to recognize the harm you are doing, and to restore the right of all delegates to be heard fairly and fully before you move on any further. Civil rights and liberties in a democratic society are not just designed to serve the needs of the common people. Allowing groups to protest is not a grand gesture by those in positions of authority, power, and influence. These rights are the result of lessons learned in history. A state can create false divisions amongst people with a goal of maintaining peace, creating conflict, or distracting from truth. It is a difficult balance. Many leaders have learned this lesson at their peril. Introduce extra limits, inconveniences, then roadblocks, and eventually there's revolution. Human beings can only take so much pressure. People controlled and pressure will eventually rebel against each other, and then those in control. There must be a release. As a child born in the city of Derry in the north of Ireland, the first time I heard of a protest was when I was 8 years old and there was a peaceful civil rights march that turned into mayhem when the police dispersed the people with tear gas and batons. My mother had been shopping and the panicked crowd advanced on her and my 4-year-old brother in his stroller. She did what any mother would do. She yanked him out of the unprotected stroller and shoved him into the public iron garbage can. My poor brother didn't know what he had done to deserve such treatment. Mr. Mayor, City Council, it is funny until it is not. 4 years later, on the 30th of January, 1972, British soldiers opened fire on unarmed civil rights marchers, killing 14 people in our city. This left an indelible mark in our history and informed our actions since. It galvanized the community until this day and took over 50 years before the English government admitted their actions were unjustified. There were no armed civilians. Protests are a release. Today, you are on the threshold of overreaching your position in this community and initiating controls and pressure where they are not needed. While the bylaw in question is redundant and quite possibly against the Canadian Bill of Rights, it is overt and public. You are on a very slippery slope, in my opinion. When I first heard of the so-called bubble bylaw, I thought that makes sense, putting aside the fact that it does nothing practical to change anything that is not already covered by current laws. It is still beyond your mandate. You are limited to creating such laws only if you can prove that there is a threat beyond the scope of existing recourse. This bylaw does not meet such criteria. I move on the wording of this bylaw. It uses the term safe access to vulnerable social infrastructure. Is not all infrastructure entitled to safe access under current laws? If so, why single out certain institutions such as faith-based buildings or government buildings, etc.? In my view, this bylaw aims to create protection for institutions that have, by their own actions in history, forfeited their rights to such privilege. Democracy promotes equal rights for all. To quote Animal Farm by George Orwell, you risk creating a 2 legs good, 4 legs better paradigm. I recognize the wording in 10.1 has been modified, but the original intent of the bylaw has not changed. Let's start with a government that stripped Indigenous people in this occupied land of basic dignity, their culture, language, faith, and lives. This government sent police and community agents into the homes of these extraordinary people and took their children from them. The last residential school was closed in 1996, not that far back in history for most of us to remember. Christian churches were also complicit in the abuses of the Indigenous people. I have sat in this forum and listened to an unofficial modification of the wording in your official land acknowledgement, implying we have all been big, happy, cooperative community that has built a great nation. Such hypocrisy is an insult to the Indigenous and Black people that were excluded from our communities and barred from opportunities. But you claim the government officials are the vulnerable ones. Okay, moving on, the places of faith. I'm a Roman Catholic and ashamed of the actions of some of these representing mine and other Christian faiths, mentally, physically, and sexually abusing children for generations. When caught, the common practice was to transfer the offender to another parish to do more harm. I love my faith, as lived and taught by Jesus Christ, but I know in my heart he would join any protest that walked up to the very door of any church and demand justice and accountability. He would not see them as vulnerable ones. Do not conflate Jewish with Israeli. Do not conflate Zionism with Jewish. Real estate agents in Canada are using the protections afforded synagogues to circumvent the international laws this country agreed to enforce. They can even do it under your present guidelines because they can have a religious ceremony at the same time as they sell real estate in the West Bank. They are promoting and selling land owned by Palestinian people to citizens of Canada. This is against international law as set out by the International Criminal Court, of which Canada is a signatory. This land, which all the international bodies have agreed is illegally occupied by Israel, Israel has no right to be there by all world standards. These Zionist real estate agents are acting within the confines of the property of some synagogues. Not all. They sell the land in occupied territories and Israel evicts the legal occupants. Then these Zionists claim that they are a part of a vulnerable group. They are not. Personally, I have been a part of many social justice groups led by Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the last 40 years. I have fought to promote the education of the Holocaust at all levels of education. I have worked with people of conscience that do not practice any faith. It is about humanity. It is about justice. The smokescreen of right or left, us and them, is a distraction. It is gaslighting in the most insidious kind. I have been among the Palestinian groups for the last 18 months, and I can say hand on heart, they are not being anti-Semitic when they criticize their oppressors. Israel is a political entity. Zionism is a political ideology and not entitled to have any special protection from people's freedom of speech. It certainly does not come under the purview of any municipality. Just like the Irish and Palestinians, the Jewish people are some of the most resilient people in history that have much to be proud of. They have been demonized and scapegoated for centuries by Christians and Europeans. Laws were put in place to ensure they didn't succeed in business, etc. They adapted and thrived. However, Israel bombs on children, drops bombs on children, hospitals, kills medics, and buries them in the sand. They have targeted churches and mosques, bombing and killing those that have sought sanctuary. This is contrary to the tenets of the Jewish faith. This council has no legal basis to interfere with our federally protected rights and freedoms. I believe your legal counsel has already advised you of this. Do not waste the city's financial resources bringing in redundant, legally indefensible bylaws against those only trying to speak for the oppressed, dead, and dying. In closing, I would like to suggest, if you want to stand for the rights of the vulnerable, look to the over 50,000 Palestinians killed in the past year and a half by an oppressive regime, armed to the teeth against a relatively defenseless population. 2 million people being denied water, food, medical assistance, and basic human needs. Look to the existing laws and your conscience. Vote accordingly. It is not funny. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir, for your time. Madam Clerk, the next delegation.
Jason Gutman.
Mr. Gutman, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you, Your Worship. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Yes, actually, thank you, we can.
Thank you. My name is Jason Gutman, and my family and I have enjoyed living in Oakville for many years. My wife is an elementary school teacher, and my son has attended school from elementary through graduation right here in Oakville. I'm speaking to you as a resident of Oakville. I know you're all probably tired and have heard a lot of these discussions already over the last couple of council meetings, but I would appreciate just a couple of minutes just to hear an Oakville resident's perspective. I'd like to start off by saying that I do support the bylaw, although I'd like to request a modification to Councillor Noel's proposed amendments. I am a little confused as to the purpose or the rationale behind the amendments. I know that you probably had these discussions internally, but I'd like to present my perspective and maybe give you some thoughts about those amendments and why I'm a little confused or what I would suggest. With respect to the proposed support or the support of the bylaw, it is disappointing to me that some individuals are using this important feedback forum as a platform to make political points. At the last meeting, I think the chair, you were very clear about the purpose of the delegation was to provide feedback about the bylaw. And it wasn't supposed to be a podium for political protests about Gaza, the terrorists, Israel, or whatever else the discussion happens to be about the politics. And it's disappointing to me that, it's interesting that another delegate presented herself as an educator, yet contravened the direction of the chair and displayed a symbol of Palestinian protest in her presentation. And this behavior is really a perfect example of people not respecting the rules or feeling that they don't have to apply if you have a cause. And we want to illustrate that the people who are typically persecuted are the ones who need protection, and the people who aren't persecuted want to keep the rules the same. We've heard several important legal arguments today, and I mean, I trust the town. I understand that you probably got enough legal advice on the bylaw. I don't think I've heard anybody in the delegation say that we should leave the Charter of Rights or not abide by the Charter of Rights, and that we, all agree, or some of us agree, that the freedom of expression is not absolute, that there are limitations on this freedom, and first and foremost, we need to protect our citizens. That freedom of expression does not trump the safety and security of our citizens here in Oakville. By their very nature, protests are designed to disrupt, upset, and draw attention. And I think all of you have seen this firsthand. And the purpose of this bylaw, the way that I see it, is to protect our community and to provide safe spaces to live, learn, and worship. And I want you to imagine for just a moment, if protesters entered town hall at any time to disrupt you, town staff, or other citizens that are there. We need safe spaces. We need places where people can think, console each other, care, and celebrate without fear of harassment or even protest. The individuals arguing against this bylaw may not want or need the protection, but the vulnerable in our society and the persecuted, as I said, I think do need that protection. And I'm asking you to remember that as you make your decisions going forward. I don't understand the delay in a year. I guess I do in some respects, Councillor Noel and Council, in that I think it may be easier to postpone a decision on something that may be complicated or may have a lot of people in the town providing feedback about that. But I think that you need to show the leadership that we can't abandon the vulnerable infrastructure in our town just because we're waiting for the federal government to make a decision. We know in politics, and I think you know firsthand, that sometimes a desire to maintain a timetable may be a wish, maybe a desire, but it's never a for sure. Just because we think that there may be a decision in a year doesn't mean that we can't protect our schools and our healthcare and our places of worship starting today. And I want you to consider that the bylaw calls for an immediate protection of the municipality, of the town, I think facilities, if I'm correct, starting today at all times without exception when the bylaw is passed. Why is that not the case for our schools? Why are we subjecting our kids and our parents and the teachers to protests when we're protecting the municipality, we're protecting that infrastructure? Clearly, somebody has made a decision that you don't want protests in the town facilities or town infrastructure. And I just think that the same should be applied to the rest of our social vulnerable infrastructure. My wife, who's been a teacher for 20 years, has seen the effect that protests have on children who, again, are vulnerable, don't necessarily understand the complexities of global politics. And I'm not advocating for one side or the other, but I am saying that we should have a safe space. And as much as we evolve our schools to remove, soft drinks or unhealthy foods or corporate advertising, we need to take the politics out of our schools and create those as safe spaces. I want you to imagine for a moment that you've lost somebody close to you, that you're going to a place of worship, or that you're going to a celebration at a school, whether it's a graduation or whether it's a parent-teacher night, and the number of vehicles that are parked there and the distance it takes to get to that facility, it's not 20 meters or 30 meters or even 50 meters. 100 meters is a reasonable distance to, I think, have protests at. And I say that as, somebody who I'm prepared to go and protest against something that I feel strongly about. But if I have kids with me or I'm going to a wedding, it's not the right time or place to disrupt me. And, in this moment of joy, in this moment of solace, if I'm dealing with a funeral, this is not what I need to see. And if I'm mentally unhealthy, and I need to go for that consolation, then I want to have that safe space. And this goes back to, I guess, the last point that I'll make, and that is that places of worship in the proposal are only protected at the time of service. And I don't understand that. I don't understand why we don't see these places as somebody coming into a church or a mosque, as I said, when they've lost somebody, or for religious classes, or to pray outside of a service. There are times to meet with your leaders, times to meet with your communities. There are community events to raise funds or to give back to the community. And I just think that we need to consider that if you put a constraint on or a limitation on only at times of service, then protesters are going to feel that they can show up at any time outside of a specifically denoted time of service. And I think that you're going to run into some problems. And we as a community want to identify that not only are these places safe during a time of service, but when somebody's in a time of need, whether it's a healthcare service or a school, we just don't want to have protests around certain places. And I'm all for protesting. I'm all for democracy. I'm all for freedom of expression. And I think everybody is. But we just have to control that. And we can't allow the freedom convoy to take over, or anti-vaxxers to create, this disruption in our healthcare. We have to start evolving. And again, I appreciate the difficult position that you're in, listening to both sides. But that's just my perspective, and I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate yours, and thank you very much for bringing it to us. I understand from the clerk that that's the last of our delegations, Council, and so I'm going to confine the discussion to table. I'm going to thank the delegates for their many fine contributions to our deliberations. I have a number of questions for the proposer. When it gets to be my turn in our discussion, I will endeavor to go last, and I will limit myself to questions rather than debate, just to stay in the chair and so on. I believe that Councillor Knoll and Councillor Lischina might appreciate the opportunity to reflect on what we've heard for us and advise us of any thoughts or changes that they're prompted or minded to do, and just to try to establish what we're going to be debating. Councillor Knoll.
Thank you, Worship. Before I begin, I'm just wondering, Councillor Chenna deferred till following the delegations. I wonder if she wanted to go first, and I'd be happy to follow her if she wants to do it that way.
Councillor Lischina.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you to all the delegations for your input tonight. Councillor Knoll and I put this motion forward because members of our community are feeling unsafe, and in places where they should be safe, in particular places of worship. This was clearly presented by the Interfaith Council in their delegation at the last meeting. We've heard examples in our town and surrounding areas about protests taking place that were not so peaceful. The topic of protests is a personal one to me. As a person in the diaspora who has gone to protests in the GTA against Russian aggression in Ukraine, and prior to that, joining the Ukrainian diaspora in solidarity, supporting Ukrainians in their home country who actually protested a Kremlin-backed president in their own country, resulting in that protest removing that person who was run out of the country, literally. So I understand how important it is to have the diaspora voices heard, but I also understand it's important that they are heard by decision makers. And as the last speaker or last delegation just said, there are times and places for that. The balance between free speech and safety of residents, whether it's physical or psychological, I also take very seriously. I believe what Councillor Knoll and I have put forth in this motion is indeed balanced. And I hope that my council and our council colleagues support that so that people can go into places of worship without fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Knoll.
Thank you, Worship. And thank you, Councillor Chenna, for those eloquent words. You've expressed a number of my comments, so I will be able to condense some of mine. First of all, a couple things I just want to reemphasize as we go into this portion of today's meeting, to reemphasize, I should say, what this isn't. This is not, notwithstanding what you heard tonight, this is not a ban on protests. It's not a suppression of dissent in any way whatsoever. This is effectively regulating bad behavior in those activities and in this particular iteration of the bylaw at places of worship, full stop. I mean, there's nothing that will stop a group of protesters from walking down the street in front of a church across the street on public property holding signs that says, we believe in X, Y, or Z. As long as they're behaving themselves and they're not conducting themselves in a way that is intimidating or otherwise blocking access or otherwise conducting themselves in one of those fairly narrow areas that are described under the bylaw, then their rights are completely enshrined. The interesting thing about tonight's discussion is that, notwithstanding trying to make this debate about Palestine and Gaza and Israel, other than that, I pretty much agree with everything everybody said, in the sense that we can't suppress the right to free speech. We can't suppress the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. And that's not what this bylaw is intended to do. It is simply intended to regulate certain aspects of protests that get out of hand and start to negatively impact the rights of others. That's really what this is all about. I also want to point out something that's really important, and this is really two interesting quotes that I had pulled up for last week's discussion. I just want to pull them up here. Because they really speak to, I think, an important part of what we're doing here. And that is that this bylaw isn't being crafted, or it's not being crafted with the intent to enforce with the intent to enforce. It's being crafted with the intent to regulate behavior. And I'm going to cite two quotes. Lon Fuller, who is a legal theorist from Harvard Law School, stated, "The effectiveness of laws lies in enforcement. The effectiveness of law lies not in enforcement, but its ability to guide behavior." And the second is from James Q. Wilson, who is an American political scientist. I couldn't find a Canadian quote. I apologize. So this is a not shop Canadian quote session, but here's a second quote. "Law is made is not made to be enforced, it's made to be obeyed. Now, Councillor Elgar and some others have been around for a while will recall that we have gone through this exercise before, where we have had to really take a strong stand on particular issues that were of importance to Oakville, that were not necessarily easy to be enforced at the end of the day, and they were not easy to, when we didn't have clear prima facie evidence of defensibility in front of the Supreme Court, and those were smoking bylaws, anti-pesticide bylaws, bylaws relating to suntanning by minors. But we took a stand as a municipality. We thought, and we knew from our constituents that these were important issues, and we took a stand on this. Now, there's a couple things that came up in today's debate I want to be clear on. One of the delegates said that the Halton police stopped the protest at the Hindu temple on Bronte Road. The police did not stop it. They were in consultation with the Hindu temple, and the Hindu temple made the decision to stop it on their own. We, in fact, offered them our parking lot at Halton Police to conduct the activity they were going to conduct. So I just want to be clear about that. The police are not in the business of stopping protesters. They're in the business of enforcing laws and maintaining order. I also wanted to talk about a little bit about what was interpreted in the police presentation, which talks a little bit about the issues at hand when it comes to why this bylaw is important. The police talked a lot about the fact that the issues that they dealt with, or they haven't had any criminality issues up to this point at protests. Certainly some borderline ones, but no issues of criminality at the protests, and therefore no charges were laid. And this is one of the benefits of the bubble bylaw, whereas the police are reactive. They respond after a law is violated. The priest or the rabbi or the imam or whoever is upset calls the police and they react after the fact, whereas a bylaw sets standards and establishes proactive measures to say you can and can't do this in advance. It's not subject to interpretation. That's just the way it is. The bylaw itself scopes the protections to all individuals within those defined zones, whereas with the police have to deal with variable factors, and that is interpretation of things like harassment, and that becomes a much more difficult thing and a harder thing for them to charge. Their bar is much higher when it comes to, much lower when it comes to charging under the criminal code, whereas a bylaw becomes a little easier to apply in those cases. The timeliness, the bylaw is immediate prohibition of disruptive presence before escalation. Okay, that's a really important one. Before the things get out of hand, a bylaw can prohibit it, stipulate exactly what the rules are, let people know in advance, and make sure that those are articulated, whereas the police only act once the disruption occurs. And that's a really big piece that could have resulted or could have saved a lot of grief in other jurisdictions. So there's a lot of these differences between what the police can do and what bylaw can do, what a clear set of standards can do versus what the criminal code subject to interpretation can do. And that's one of the real tools that are provided not only to our municipal enforcement folks, but also to the police, that they can use this to really get ahead of problems before they're created.
Councillor Knoll?
Yeah.
We have an idea in our procedure bylaw of a 5-minute limit at this stage of a consideration of a matter. I'll interrupt you to see if another councillor wants to go, and then we could come back to you for your second 5 minutes.
Sure, that'd be fine.
And while you reflect on it, I'll just look for other councillors who want to volunteer for their comments. Anybody? Oh, look, we have some. Councillor Hazlitt-Thiel.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Burton. Could somebody on staff just please clarify? One of the delegates inferred that municipalities, so the inference I took from what he interpreted was that town hall and other spaces would be protected along with places of worship. And when I read it, my understanding is only if there were worship services happening at a municipal facility. So could I just get clarification of what it says and means, because that's certainly not what the delegate took away.
Councillor, Solicitor Chandra is approaching the microphone for you.
Through you, Mayor Burton, to Councillor Hazlitt-Thiel, the way you've summarized it is correct.
that it would only apply as drafted now to places of, municipal facilities where it's being used for temporarily as a place of worship, where there's services or ceremonies taking place.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification. I hope the delegate's still online and hears that, because I wouldn't want him to think we're just trying to protect a municipal building. This is actually about safe access to a place of worship. I have some questions that require a legal response, Mayor Burton. The appropriate time, I'd like to go in camera to get ask the lawyers for their legal perspective.
That's noted. Thank you very much for the notification. Councillor Adams, I thought you had your hand up.
I had the exact same question. It's now been answered. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? I have a question for Councillor Knoll. I understood you to be reframing, your new version of your bylaw. I understood you to be attempting to set it up so that a place of worship would not be immune to this protest bylaw. It would not be immune to protests if it were being used for a purpose such as land sales. And that land sales issue came up again and again. Is that in fact what you set out to do here?
Well, I believe that the wording is pretty clear in the bylaw. It talks about the fact that that it would be for services or for teaching fellowship and community social outreach. So I don't think the commercial sale of property would fall under any of those guidelines, or any other non-religious or worship related activity. So a funeral would be included, a church service would be included, a Sunday school, Saturday school, whatever whatever different faiths have different days, whatever sort of educational, ceremonial, service-oriented activity would be covered, but not a real estate transaction. I've never even heard of that, but I mean, yeah, that would not be contemplated in the bylaw, in my interpretation.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification, because there were quite a number of delegations who were suggesting that land sales would somehow be protected. Councillor Hazlitt-Thiel would like to convene a session closed to the public for the purpose of receiving legal information subject to, that is privileged under the Municipal Act and our procedure bylaw, and the communications necessary therefore. As I just gloss over the exact words of that provision. Is there a seconder for her motion? Councillor Knoll, thank you. Is there any objection? There being no objection, we will arrange the meeting to be closed to the public for the amount of time it takes for the provision of the legal advice. Let me just turn off my mic and check and see how long or that would take, in case this is a good opportunity for a brief break. Council, you have 5 minutes for a Coke break or a water break or whatever pleases you. My slides. Oh. All right. Council has resumed its public session, having been in a session closed to the public for the purpose of receiving advice from our solicitors and the communications necessary for that purpose. Who's first? I need hands in order to. Don't be shy. Somebody has to move or say something. Councillor Knoll.
Well, I believe I've already moved the motion previously, so I'll move the motion that Councillor Luschina and I wish to put forward with respect to that I read earlier in today's session.
Yeah, you're quite right. We did move the motion at the last meeting, but because this is you're substituting a new text, I thought maybe belt and suspenders will recognize a motion from you and Councilor Chinna again.
Okay,
Are
would
there
you
any-
like me to read it back into the record, or was the record sufficient earlier?
I think it would be great if you read it again. I noticed during the delegations the possibility that not everybody had heard you
Sure.
or been here or been present to hear you.
Okay, well then, in that spirit, then I am moving the following motion: that one, the revised draft bylaw 2025-088 be passed, which includes the following amendments. One, the bylaw shall apply only to places of worship as well as premises used on a temporary basis to host religious ceremonies or services. Two, the bylaw shall apply only during the times that such services or ceremonies are actively taking place, including a reasonable period immediately before and after. That three, the bylaw shall apply to all municipal properties or parts thereof within 50 meters from the boundaries of the properties in paragraph A. Two, that the revised draft bylaw 2025-089 bylaw to amend the administrative penalties for non-parking violations and orders by law 2021-038 be passed. Three, the consideration of the bylaw's application to any other forms of vulnerable social infrastructure, such as healthcare, social services, or educational institutions, shall be deferred for a period of 1 year to allow time for the federal government to act on its commitment made during the 2025 federal election, as announced by Prime Minister Mark Carney to introduce protective legislation. Four, that staff be directed to monitor federal developments and return to council with a report and recommendations no later than June 1, 2026 regarding the potential future expansion of the bylaw's application to other vulnerable social infrastructure. Five, the council requests the Attorney Generals of Ontario and Canada introduce legislation to make it an offense to intentionally and willfully obstruct access to any place of worship, school, and any other vulnerable social infrastructure, and an offense to willfully intimidate or threaten those attending services at these locations while allowing the peaceful protests or demonstrations. And finally, six, a copy of this resolution shall be forwarded to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, the Minister of the Attorney General for Ontario, the Members of Parliament and Provincial Parliament for Oakville, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to express the town's support for federal action to protect places of worship and other community spaces from targeted protest and hate-motivated disruption. And I believe that Councillor Chinna will be seconding that motion.
I do believe. Councilor Chinna.
I second that motion.
Thank you. All right. Any speakers to the motion? Councillor Knoll.
Just very briefly, I know I went on at quite a level of detail. I'm not going to continue that. I just do want to say, I want to thank everybody on council for your patience while we've gone through this. It's been several meetings and it has not been easy. I want to thank all the delegations, notwithstanding what position that they've taken on this thing. All of the submissions with, unfortunately some disruptions were very thoughtful, well-intended, and certainly deeply held, and we do appreciate those. The decision is not easy. It is an answer to actual events that have happened in our community. We think that we've scoped it to a point where it is an acceptable approach to take while we await further action from the federal government. So once again, thank you to everybody, and I ask for everybody's support, and I'll be looking for a recorded motion, Your Worship, a recorded vote.
Thank you, Councillor. Other speakers? If I could say a word then. I want to note that Oakville demonstrations and protests have been civil, or at least peaceful. Second, that the police, far from suppressing demonstrations and protests, they've supported them, and they've done that no matter what organization the chief might belong to. I myself have marched in protests, although not at places of worship. I think that the submissions that have been accepted this evening, I have accepted the submissions of the delegations tonight with their oblique references and embedded charges against other entities abroad, skirting, as they did, the edge of our need to focus on the bylaw's need or lack of need and the terms therein. Questions about things not in the bylaw I have considered and set aside as extraneous, given the limited nature of this bylaw and the narrow scoping. I believe that the definition of the place of worship and the activities to be protected there in the bylaw operates throughout the bylaw, and that's why I do not see a need to repeat the definition on a clause-by-clause basis. And I am very glad that real estate sales are not protected in any way by this bylaw. Have we shown a need? I hesitated on this, but the bylaw will definitely assist the case where the disruption was clear and from out of town in the case of the Vishnu Devi temple. And the BC case I found persuasive. And although I'm worried that we don't have the fully necessary evidentiary basis that we should have, I think we can try with this bylaw because it's so narrowly scoped. And nevertheless, I'm not sure we can have confidence in the outcome. But we have gone here before, as Councillor Knoll pointed out, on smoking and tanning and other things, and not only succeeded, but led the country to a better place on those things. And so for those reasons, I think that because of the limited scope, we're likely to do two things. I think we might survive a challenge, and I also think we might disappoint everybody. And there is political wisdom to the effect that you've really got it right when nobody's happy, but when both sides are unhappy, maybe you've definitely found the middle anyway. And here we are trying to find a middle between two positions of no regulation at all and more regulation. So I'll be supporting the motion. With your permission, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll call vote, the recorded vote.
Mayor Burton.
Yes.
Councillor McNeese.
Yes.
Councillor Dudek.
Yes.
Councillor Haslett-Thiel.
Yes.
Councillor Giddings.
Yes.
Councillor Elgar.
Yes.
Councillor Longo.
Yes.
Councillor Knoll.
Yes.
Councillor Grant.
Yes.
Councillor Adams.
Yes.
Councillor Lischina.
Yes.
Councillor Shia.
Yes.
And that carries unanimously.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your patience and your cooperation with the chair. We need a mover and seconder for consideration of the confirmatory bylaw. Councillor Longo and Councillor Elgar, thank you for the representation from Ward 4 there on this motion. Is there any objection to the motion? Madam Clerk, there being none, that is carried. Now, we also need, so this motion was for the confirmatory bylaw and bylaw 2025-089 as listed in the agenda, and bylaw 2025-088 as listed. That ends the work of this meeting that started on May 1st. It's been a real pleasure working with you, given your careful consideration of this matter, and that ends the meeting. Good night.